Okay, and if not, we move on to the diversity share. So if anyone has any news or events to share about diversity on campus or off campus, anything like that. So I guess there's a few things that Nate forwarded to me, and he's unable to be here today, unfortunately. But the first is the UD Anti-Racism Initiative is holding a rally against banned books, and that's going to take place on May 3rd. So what they said in their email is, please join us in a Freedom to Learn rally. Public education is under attack. So our idea is, join us to speak out against nationwide efforts to undermine critical thinking. What we read, study, and teach matters. The Freedom to Learn rally includes readings from banned books and is part of a national day of action on Wednesday, May 3rd. The rally will take place from 12 to 1 p.m. on the South Green Memorial Hall steps. So if anyone's interested in that, you can also reach out to me in email and I can forward along what Nate sent to me. And the second thing is that the College of Earth, Ocean, and Environment had its diversity town hall meeting yesterday. So in case people couldn't make it to that, I'll just post the link to the recording in the chat. Yeah. Okay, so if nobody else has anything to share, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker. So I'm very happy today to introduce Dr. Jola Ajibade. She's associate professor of geography and a scholar activist who applies both environmental justice and political ecology lenses to study the intersections of climate risk, urban disasters, resilience planning, coastal management, and societal transformations. Broadly speaking, her research focuses on how individuals, communities, and cities respond to global climate change and their different capacities for adaptation and transformation. In her recent research, she examines how climate adaptation solutions, such as managed retreat programs, floating cities, tree plantings, and utopian development projects, intertwine with exclusionary planning practices to reproduce structural and historical injustices, thereby exacerbating racial, gender, and class-based inequalities and undermining the capabilities of marginalized communities to respond to climatic and socioeconomic crises. In her work, Dr. Ajibade advances ideas about just urban adaptation through embracing feminist, decolonial, and anti-racist approaches, as well as care ethics that can lead to more just, livable, and sustainable urban futures. She obtained her MA in International Law and Human Rights from University for Peace and her PhD in Geography and Environmental Sustainability from Western University, Canada. Jola currently leads 2 large multidisciplinary projects funded through NCAR and NSF, which utilize climatology, GIS data, and on-the-ground interviews to study complex human and environmental systems. Dr. Ajibade's work has been featured in many academic journals and media outlets, including Science Friday, NPR, Yale Environment 360, Science, New Internationalist, and Vice. So with that introduction, I'll pass it on over to Jola for her talk.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you everyone for being here. I know it's a Friday where people get a break, but thank you for spending your afternoon with me and at the seminar. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. Let's see. Yeah, so that's good. I think everyone can see. I do feel at home joining this department to share my work, in part because of the multiple connections that I have to people here, Matt being one of the people, and you can see his name on the project as well. But also Pinky was Matt's supervisor and my friend and colleague Sides, who couldn't be here today. So I do feel that, you know, I'm coming home to share some of the work that I've been doing. So thank you for the invitation again. And what I want to talk about is this idea around the shifting landscapes of spatial equity and justice, who is vulnerable or who is resilient to cascading and consecutive hazard. And all of this in the Portland metro region. And all of this work, the idea of, you know, vulnerability, resilience, or even justice or cascading and consecutive disasters or hazard does require unpacking exactly what do they mean. And so I would try my best to unpack them a little bit, because we're looking at them in this work from a spatial, but also a temporal dimensions, and over a range of factors, as you would see. But I do want to acknowledge that this work is a walk done by a village, not just me, as you can see a range of names there. So it's multiple people coming together, giving their thoughts, ideas, and skill to help really solidify what we're learning in this project. And I do want to thank the funders of the project, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, who also is funded by NSF. And yeah, I don't know how many people are aware that in the last 3 years, Portland region, we had a record chartering heat wave, which was around 46 degrees Celsius, if you use Celsius like I do. I'm originally from Nigeria, so Celsius is what we typically say. But here, if you use Fahrenheit, it was around 116 degrees Fahrenheit, so pretty hot. And we also had a Labor Day wildfire in 2020. We also had air pollution. We had a major snowstorm. So we had all of these multiple events. And what we're trying to do today, or what I'm trying to present to you, is how these events, how we're using data to understand who is indeed vulnerable, how they were exposed, but also who, or spatially, where are the tracts that are resilient. And so that's what I hope to share with you. And because, it's going to be about 47 slides until you get the whole story, but I often like to share major takeaways, before I go into my talk. And one of the takeaways from this work is that we found that communities that are socially vulnerable and living in areas of low resilience were also the areas that were hardest hit by the consecutive and cascading disasters. And that social vulnerability is actually a strong predictor of the tracts where people died, not just the heat wave itself, as you would say from the data I'm going to share with you. And also that, one of the arguments we're making in this work is to show that to ensure equitable resilience, we need to rethink and also redesign our hazard mitigation plans, our adaptation policies and safety nets to actually address a higher threshold of multiple risks. And so those are the major takeaways that I hope people would keep in mind as I go through this. Just a quick agenda. We all know climate change is, a global wicked problem. So I wouldn't beat that. I think that message is clear from whether it's from the IPCC or from other readings or news report. I think everybody knows that we're dealing with a very complex challenge. So I'll probably start my talk just showing what else is happening elsewhere, and then focusing on some of the research we're doing here in Portland, research question driving this work, and then findings and also future work. So not only in 2022, all across the world, we're hearing of multiple hazards. If you think about Pakistan, for instance, in 2022, more than 30 million people were displaced by flood. India, there's the heat waves, here in the US as well. So the problem we're talking about, the issues of hazard and consecutive and cascading hazard, is happening in major parts of the world, even though this talk today is focused on Portland. But we need to kind of remember that it's also a global challenge, especially when we are thinking about the ways in which climate change is changing the ways risks is being experienced in different parts of the world. And so when I say we need to unpack, unpacking so many words, but first, the key one, which is essential to this work, is this issue of cascading and consecutive disaster. Different writers, scholars have different definition for what they describe as cascading disasters. And, if you think about a single hazard can have cascading effects, right? It can have a domino effect where you have a flooding leading to landslide, leading to pollution of water. And so one hazard can have a cascading effect, but also you could have instances where multiple hazards happen together, right? So you could have a situation which in Portland, we did have some of that where you have, another hazard that is not climate related, like COVID was happening, and then you had the Labor Day wildfire, and then some months after we had the heat wave. So it could be where multiple hazards happen at the same time. For the cascading side, the way in which we're conceptualizing it in this work is to think about the physical connections between those hazards, where one hazard could have a trigger effect for multiple sequential hazards as connected to it. So think about the wildfire. Obviously, with a wildfire, you would see a lot of smoke. That you could think about those relationships as cascading. And when you think about consecutive hazard, the way we're looking at it in this work is not necessarily the cascading side. It's how multiple hazards happened one after the other, especially maybe 2 months or 3 months gap or 4 months gap before people could recover, another one happens. And so there is a consecutive side and there is the cascading side. And from the work of people like Pescorelli and Alexander, and there are multiple ways you can think about, the causal factors, right? Climate change could be one of the drivers for some of this hazard, with a background of other underlying risks, and it could cause disruptions to infrastructure. And also you could have on the other side, global dependency, natural human system, technological systems also being a driver or creating a failure in the system. And then there is also the language that people use, right? There are people who say it's compounding disaster, compounding risks. People use cascading, interconnected. So there are all of these kind of languages that are out there. But for us, we're looking at hazards that are connected physically, like wildfire and smoke, but also hazards that happen sequentially months after the other before people could recover. So that's what we're looking at, and the different impacts on different groups. And before I share some of the findings of that key work that I'm going to open up today, is that a lot of this work has a lot of history to it. And the history is that in 2018, which is when I started working here in Portland, I was curious about the types of disasters that people were experiencing in this location, and people rated, well, I forgot to have that slide. They had many disasters that were, many hazards that they were concerned about. But then I created an hypothetical scenario asking them that, okay, what if there were in this region, if we were to experience more flooding, more heat wave, more wildfire? That was scenario A, where there is an increase in climatic risks. And then scenario B being a scenario where you have those climatic risks happening, but then you also had an aging population. Do they think that the current risk management in Portland will be sufficient to address this type of risks? And then scenario C being a situation where you have the baseline climatic risks, but then you have increased inequality in the system where more people are actually poorer than you've had in past. And then the scenario D being a situation where same climatic risks, where you have experiencing more heat waves and wildfire, but then you have diminished governance capacity. By that, you have, let's say, less than or half of what the government would typically spend on the per capita to deal with hazard. It can no longer afford to spend that much money, whatever reason. Well, all of the scenarios, while they're interesting, COVID did make some of them happen in some ways, but I'll talk about the COVID side of things. But the response for people, based on this scenario, which was very hypothetical at the time, the city experts that I spoke to, and I was projecting into the future, say in 20 years, if we were to experience all of these multiple scenarios, how do you think the risk management needs to change? And a lot of them said there needs to be major changes in the ways in which the Portland region is actually dealing with or might deal with any of the scenario, whether it's A or B or C. You can see the B being one that they were not, the scenario that they were not too worried about, like, with increased disaster risks or an aging population, they feel we may have resources to deal with aging population. But overall, you can see that everyone says there has to be major changes in how we deal with risks. And that was 2018, no COVID, no major disaster yet. And the part of the qualitative story that came out of that work was we're asking them, or I was asking them, why do you have a low perception of Portland's resilience to these disasters? What do you think is going on? And many of the things people mentioned was that, that they felt there's inequality in how we prepare and respond. And this person actually said, I don't know that we're prepared as a city or even as private industry or individuals. And they mentioned that, the city wasn't prepared for a localized forest wildfire fire that happened in Puel Butte, that we were not prepared for a flooding in Fulton Creek, and that we're struggling to address those issues. But if it becomes more, then it'll be certainly a struggle going forward. And then they said, I think it comes back to issues of equity, because people with private insurance and savings will have more choices and will be able to recover. But as a city, if you look at it as a system and as a city, that it's not sufficient to have just a few people have resources, but majority do not. So that's one issue that came out of that work. And the other thing they said was they were also concerned about lack of coordination across the multiple governments, or no, should I say governance systems that we have in place. And they another expert has said, I don't see a rapid departure from what we currently have. We have a government that is incredibly divided. And here they're not talking about Republican and Democratic divide. That's not the argument in the Portland region. It's about the top tier divide. They were saying we have the metro government, the city government, the county government, and sometimes who is responsible to address what type of risks, when they need to show up, who should be disposing certain funds. It's not often clear. So there is this overlap of duty, but also when the events happen, it takes time for anybody to show up. And so those were some of the concerns that people were raising in terms of why they felt the city wasn't ready to deal with any major climatic disasters. And then comes 2020, right? So the interview I did was in 2018. Obviously, in 2017, there was a few hazards that happened. And 2018, there was a air pollution, which people were concerned about. 2019, we kind of had a free pass. But 2020, we had the global pandemic, which affected everybody in the world. And then while that was going, that became the backdrop for many things that happened, right? And obviously the global pandemic exacerbated a lot of inequality as well, economically, housing inequality, all of those issues, food insecurity as well, but a lot of struggles that people experience here in Portland, and I think globally. But while that was happening also in May, after George Floyd was killed, there was this racial sort of awakening everywhere in the world. And particularly in Portland, we had the racial protests that went on for a month about how we need to address racial issues. And then just shortly after that, in August, we had this major wildfire that went on almost up till October in different parts of Oregon. And then the whole region, quite frankly, up until parts of Canada. I had friends calling me from Vancouver, Canada, from Victoria as well. It was all blanketed in smog. So that was something that we had to live with for a period. And I've never experienced anything like that in my life. And then shortly after, in February of 2021, we had this major snowstorm as well, where a lot of trees were down. People lost electricity for about 2 weeks. And some people had their pipe busted. So there was a lot of impact on people as well at the time. And then comes in June of 2021, where we had this major record-breaking heat wave that killed almost 100 people in Oregon. And so those were, the cascading thing that had happened, which though the questions I asked in 2018 were hypothetical, in 2020, it felt like, they did happen, but with different hazards that then occurred. Nobody foresaw the pandemic. And so the question that really, was now driving this work that is funded by NCAP is that, number one, we were trying to understand what are the climatic drivers of cascading, that sort of heat wave, particularly the wildfire and the smog that came with it, the air pollution, and then what is driving the heat wave, what's driving the air pollution, all of that. So we have climate scientists helping us to understand some of the climatic drivers and the sequences of this hazard, and then the historical trends as well of those issues. And then on the social side of the research, we're trying to understand so the uneven vulnerability, but also uneven resilience, right? So how do climate hazard interact with existing social vulnerabilities and baseline resilience factors to compound impacts for different groups? And then on the policy and system side, we're thinking, can we also think about ideas around cascading resilience, where institutional opportunities and policy can help address inequities that are existing, but also help create new forms of strategies and policies to mitigate future hazards. So these were the key major issues driving the work we did. And we looked at it on two scales, I would say. One was at the county scale, where we focused on Washington County, Multnomah County, and Clackamas. And within Multnomah County, we also looked at what was happening in the city of Portland. And in this counties, the three counties, about 1.8 million people live in this location, and it's largely white. We do have BIPOC, if you like, Black, Indigenous communities, and Latinos and Asian, but it's a largely white community. And in terms of our methods, we brought in, you can imagine the questions we're asking requires really a multidisciplinary perspective on how we answer the questions. And so our method were both mixed quantitative and qualitative, where we have past sequencing of climatic events and then future scenario modeling, which was working on that side, on that hand. And on the other end, we have, analysis of the baseline resilience indicators for communities. So we created an index to help us understand, and the SOVI index, which many people are aware of, that social vulnerability index. And then we also mapped that in relation to, did a GIS mapping of the hotspots of the hazards that I've just talked about. We interviewed communities and also did a policy analysis of existing policies and plans in the region. How are those policies relevant to the work we're doing, but also are they designed in a way that allows for effective response to current, but also to future hazard. And for the climatological context, we had, data used from the PRISM data and some other data from station data here in the Portland region. And then we also looked at shelters, how they tracked the different disasters, and also the FEMA data. And those are interesting in terms of the findings that they're not consistent. But so for the climatological trend, in terms of the 3 counties, what we found is that the hottest day of the year is actually on the rise. Though surprisingly, Clackamas, which is not completely rural, but has more rural areas, is actually the one that is warming the fastest, which was surprising to us. The hottest night of the year is also on the rise. The summer between June and August temperature are on the rise, and the number of days over 90 degrees are on the rise. All of these 3, and there are the numbers which I can share for anyone interested in by how much are they on the rise. I can share that later on. So all of these 3, if you notice that our data here started from 1985, we were trying to get a data from 1940s, we couldn't, but this was the data we were able to get. And all of these 3 here, statistically significant. The days over 90 wasn't significant, so that's what. But for our city level analysis, which we were able to get data from as far back as 1940s, and we also combine here in this case with station data. So these we were able to do an analysis that is consistent with what we did at the county level, but here some of this were statistically significant. You can see the hottest night of the year is significant, and same thing, the number of days over 90 degrees, and also the summer temperature is on the rise. The only one that isn't significant is just the hottest day at this level. And so for the shelters data, we just wanted to see what is the trend in terms of the shift and changes of hazards that have been reported. If you look here, based on this data, you have a lot of flooding and some wind largely is one of the concerns. But then when you get to 2015, you begin to see heat wave or heat showing up. You can see heat. And this is just from shelters, the analysis we did. But when we also looked at what the FEMA data, because they have different ways in which they classify risks, and what makes it into the FEMA data, what makes it into the shelters are not necessarily the same. But based on the FEMA data, we're able to get a lot of the hazard that was recorded, or the disasters that were recorded, were largely flood related. And you can see in between 2003 up until 2012 was flood and windstorm. But then when you get here, wildfire showed up in 2014, 2017, 2018, and then 2021, 2020 and 2021, we had this data on wildfire and air pollution. Let's just put it at the back of my mind. And then let's think about the individual consecutive events that we did analyze for this work and why they matter. So in 2020, when we had that Labor Day wildfire, which obviously is connected with air pollution because wildfires release air pollution, this was the time period you can see that the data was collected for. So we used ODEQ station data. That's the Department of Environmental Quality, the Oregon department here, and then the Purple Air data as well. We collected 68 Purple Air data. We also had some indoor Purple Air data, though when I'm not talking about the indoor today, I'm just talking about the outdoor data. But for the analysis we did, we realized that the Purple Air station data, the magnitude of the information we were getting was not consistent with the DEQ station data. And so we had to do a calibration of both of them, following Ling and others' method to bring them together. And I'm going to show you all of the results. When you stack up all this consecutive hazard, which communities experience this in more severe way and consistently. And so the results the ice storm that we experienced, these were the areas where you had the severest -12, which for someone like me who lives in Canada, -12 is not a big deal. It's in Celsius, but it is not a big deal if you're from Canada. But at least in Oregon, it is a big deal because of our topography and the fact that we're not used to it. But also the number of days where people experience it. It's also this region, it's the Clackamas region here. And then when the heat wave, you can see the portion, the areas where communities or the deepest area where you had like up to 46 degrees Celsius, some of those dark areas. And then for the ODEQ analysis as well, you can see some of the areas where this was concentrated. And I don't know how many of you work on air pollution. What the EPA suggests is that people should not be exposed to more than 35 microcubic meter of PM 2.5, not more than that, right? But during the period, that's during the 2020 Labor Day wildfire, a lot of people were exposed to, on average, you can see some communities actually got up to 453 to 487. It's really high, from 453, sorry, to 458 exposure to PM 2.5. That is way, way, way higher than the exceedance level that EPA suggests, which is not, shouldn't be more than 35 micrograms per cubic meter. And there were communities which experienced, 233 on average, but that was still high compared to what is recommended. And so so that's on one hand. And then we looked at also where communities died in Oregon and in terms of the housing where they lived, right? So people lived in different kinds of housing during the heat wave. Some people lived in RVs, mobile homes, multi-family units, single family units, but we're trying to, as some of the results I'll be showing you, I'm going to show you where communities were at heat, but also whether they lived in some of these types of homes, what happened. And just to remind us in terms of why the connection of all of this hazard, including the heat, is important, is that there has been a lot of literature that suggests that historically areas that were redlined also experience a lot of urban heat. And in our work, we wanted to also understand, areas where you have a lot of heat, and also areas where people die during those heats. Was it also connected to the HOLC, right? And by redlining, I don't know how many of, I'm assuming a lot of people know what it means, but if you don't, it's essentially a racist policy that was implemented in the 1930s where the Federal Homeowners Association designated different areas, one being areas as best, that's areas that got a lot of funding to be able to buy housing at the time or to get loans for their housing. And then the B being desirable, and the A and B typically will be areas where white population would live. The C is designated as declining, and the D is the redlined area, which is generally areas where you have Black population and some other groups like Latinos and Asian. And so C and D are essentially areas where you have BIPOC people historically, and those were areas that were not invested in. And some of these impacts are still being felt today in terms of the disinvestment, in terms of the quality of the housing and the poverty that was passed through over time. But in the case of Portland, one of the key things we want to be mindful of is also the fact that there has been changes in terms of gentrification happening. Some of those gentrification are not happening in the A areas. Some of them are happening in the C and the D areas. And so the quality of those housing in the 1930s are not what you have today. But you may have seen that people are actually being pushed to the outskirts of the city, while a few were able to remain in the city. So during that heat wave, when it happened, we're still trying to see the connections between the redlining and heat wave. But what we noticed just from a simple analysis is to see how many people died in the areas that were historically declining or areas that were redlined. We noticed that in the redline area, it was about 5 people who died. In the Portland city analysis, not the county, because Portland is really where you had those racist policy implemented in Oregon. And so the C areas had the highest number of people in terms of the Portland level where people died within the HOLC map. And then some people died in the B areas as well, but nobody died in the A area. So that's quite interesting. And in the Portland region as well, the areas where you have a lot of trees. So it's far more greener than any of the other HOLC locations. So let's just put that at the back of our minds. But another thing I wanted to bring to people's mind is in this work, apart from thinking about historical dimensions and the connection between it and HOLC, which is important, we wanted to also understand what about the existing social vulnerabilities, like the contemporary factors, issues of poverty, housing, lack of opportunities, income. How does that shape those existing vulnerability? What is the connection between that and all of the three hazards that I've mentioned, which is heat wave, wildfire, air pollution, and snowstorm? Sorry, 4 hazards. And so we did a SOVI analysis. You can see areas of high vulnerability here. And for those who work with SOVI or who work in the disaster space, and you're familiar with Susan Cotton's work and several other people as well, there is a SOVI, but you also would know that there is a resilience, which it's not necessarily the same. They can influence each other, but they're not the same issue. And the index, the factors that have been used to calculate the SOVI are not the same factors that are used to calculate the resilience of the BRIC index. And for us, we wanted to understand, okay, we see where the social vulnerability is concentrated, but also when you look at the baseline resilience factors, like, issues around environmental factors, social capital, institutions, opportunities, all of those things, the factors that shape resilience, where are they concentrated? You can see also where low resilience is versus where the high vulnerability is. And we did a Pearson analysis to make sure that this does make sense. And you can see the number of the findings from our calculation, which indicates a perfect negative linear relationship between the variables. So really good outcome for using this to understand our work. And just to show you some of the factors shaping the SOVI, when we did a principal component analysis, some areas is the income and occupation that is shaping high vulnerability. In some areas is the race, you can see here. In some areas is because it's rural versus urban. And in some it's institutionalized communities, things like that. And then for the BRIC, which was a predetermined variable that we used to determine or do our analysis, you can see factors that shape BRIC, low BRIC. In some areas are social factors, in some areas it's lack of infrastructure, some it's institutions. But something interesting is that some areas that have lower institutional support or infrastructure, if you like, the infrastructure as the institution as well. There are also areas where you have high environmental resilience. So that's something to keep in mind, which is we thought it was interesting. And for some, what is driving low resilience is also the nature of the community. So those are key issues. And we brought this together to see when you take the top deciles for SOVI, which is high social vulnerability, and then low resilience, which community shows up, right? We wanted to see those intersections. And you can see when you bring that together for high social vulnerability and low resilience, this was what we found, areas where they showed up. So we kept that in mind, knowing that there is that intersection and those communities that are already vulnerable, but also have low resilience. And we looked at where people died. You can see a lot of people also died in this intersection, especially here in the Multnomah area. Some of them died where you have this intersection of high SOVI and low BRIC. And there were people who died in other areas as well. But the concentration, you can see where the deaths are concentrated. So that's something. We looked at nighttime temperature just to get a sense of, okay, what's good, where are the cooling resources, and what was the temperature like at night, right? So this is where the cooling resources are in terms of the library, but we did not really see the emergency shelter at all here. And you could see also the cooling centers are not necessarily concentrated. If I go back here, you see this is where people died, and you can see some libraries here, but not necessarily the cooling center. So that's something to keep in mind. And so because we're looking at this relationship between SOVI, BRIC, and consecutive hazard, we needed to bring all of these issues together. And so what we did was to do a correlation between all three, well, maybe the consecutive hazard are 4 on that end, and then the SOVI and BRIC are, 2 indexes we bring together. And first, one of the key findings, which this black box is essentially what we're trying to get at, right? Which community are in this black box where they experience the SOVI, they experience the extreme heat, they experience the freezing rain, They experienced also the wildfires and also what's called air pollution, and also have lower resilience. So that's the ultimate goal. But we started by building up that analysis until I'll show you the when everything is together. So just looking at SOVI, freezing and precipitation was the ice storm. That's another word for it in this analysis. And then the heat wave, you can see what we are trying to get at here, which communities are in this black box, right? And this is from just this analysis, just mapping these three key issues, looking at the top decile for SOVI and heat and freezing precipitation. And this community showed up, this Piedmont, this is Collie, and then this community in Clackamas also showed up in our analysis. And these is, just a clearer picture of where this is in Multnomah and where this is in Clackamas. And the interesting thing is that this community, for instance, the Piedmont community in the 19th century used to be predominantly upper class, whites, homeowners, but post-World War, it's actually changed a lot. You have a lot of renters there, you have a lot of working class, and you have some mobile homes there as well. And for the Collie neighborhood, which I'll talk a little bit more about, it used to be predominantly white as well. It's now very much Latino, or should I say more BIPOC as well. It has been an area that has been disinvested, not just historically, but even to date. They have, they don't have a lot of sewer system there. They have a lot of mobile homes, and they do have also not, some areas are not paved roads. There are not enough trees. So in terms of the character of some of the neighborhoods in the Collie areas, it is not surprising that it's showing up, even though it's surprising to us that it did show up. But when you go there and try to validate it on ground, you can see some of the inequities and poverty as well in those locations and the struggles of community. And then this location is also not too far from the airport, so they do get a lot of air pollution as well. And for the Clackamas region, this region as well, you have a lot of mobile homes in this area, and same in this area as well. And there are a few wealthy homes in some of this location, but there are a lot of poverty as well. And so when we did this analysis, not just looking at it from a SOVI perspective, when we looked at it from a BRIC perspective, where we looked at top deciles for heat and freezing precipitation, and then bottom deciles for BRIC, which is low resilience, you see more. You don't just see Collie and Piedmont, you see a lot more other groups. And this is our airport location. You see more communities actually show up in this area. And we've documented all the communities that showed up, but because of time, I'm not able to go into them. And so what we did was then to bring everything together. So this is at the county level first. So we brought the freezing precipitation, the SOVI, the heat, the wildfire, and also the smoke that came along with it. And then our baseline resilience, looking at low resilience, the top, should I say, yeah, we looked at the top deciles for SOVI and then the low 3 deciles for BRIC. And what we found doing a Spearman ranking analysis is that you would see here that there is a correlation between SOVI and BRIC. But they were negatively correlated, which means that when vulnerability goes up, resilience goes down. So that's an interesting finding. But also BRIC and deaths were negatively correlated as well, indicating that as resilience goes down, the deaths also goes up. You can see here. And same thing when you think about SOVI and deaths, they were positively correlated. I think this is one of the interesting findings, that actually SOVI showed up where more people died. It's also those tracts that were also highly socially vulnerable. And the interesting thing when you're thinking about exposure to PM 2.5, which is also one of the most positively correlated findings in our work here, you see areas that were exposed, or tracts that were exposed to PM 2.5 were also the ones that were being cooked during the heat wave. So that's one of the strongest correlation we had in our analysis. So these are communities that are getting hit by everything, by heat wave, by the deaths, and by SOVI as well. So that's something to keep in mind. But when we go to the Portland City analysis, this is the demarcation for Portland, just Portland City only, we see interesting information, or as well, still negative correlation, though different numbers this time, but there's still a negative correlation between BRIC and SOVI. And also you see this correlation between PM 2.5 and heat wave. It's actually higher at the city level. And then SOVI as well, and heat max is also high, and SOVI and death is in fact higher in terms of the correlation, right? The positive correlation compared to just heat max and death. So, which means that there were tracks that got the heat, and some people died, but tracks that had SOVI, lower or higher, a higher level of vulnerability, those were tracks where people died more. So it wasn't just about the heat, it was also that people were already socially vulnerable. And then many of them also experienced the heat, but also died. So that's something that came up from this, what we thought was interesting. So from some of our interviews, speaking to people, when we interview people in those Clackamas area that I mentioned, which were areas that were vulnerable, this person, I did an interview, spoke to this person, he's a Black Native American, he's 48 years old, and he said, the heat wave, the wildfire, and the air pollution is something that I've never experienced before. That's in his words. And he said, I never really paid that great attention to all of them. He said, I wasn't prepared. I was uneducated about how these things work. I don't know if everybody got the same information at the same time. I didn't know if we're all prepared for all of those issues here. And he said, I think it has really heightened my internal thing. By internal thing, he was talking about his pre-existing conditions, because he had, like when I saw him, it's obvious that he was healed, and he said it exacerbated his existing condition, and he pointed to all of the medications that was on his table while I was doing the interview and said, you can see all of these medications that I'm using here. And then there was another lady I spoke to, and here, this interview, she lives in Isburu, and she's a small-scale farmer, and she said, the ash from the wildfire destroyed my crops. I lost everything. I have respiratory problems. I couldn't breathe because of COVID isolation. I couldn't go out. My health worsened. I felt helpless. The problems compounded. So these were some of the stories that people were telling us. And so because of the lack of familiarity and lack of knowledge of how to deal with not just a single hazard, but the fact that those hazards happen consecutively, it was evident that the idea of resilience is not just bouncing back or bouncing forward, however people wanted to define it, but also resilience is a practice. You have to have a practice with something to know what to do with it. So the lack of practice for people meant they couldn't be resilient the way they would have wanted to, because they didn't know what to do. And so that was something that we thought, conceptualizing resilience as a practice is very important, and that knowledge and familiarity matters in how people will be able to engage. We asked people so many questions, but another question we also asked was, do they trust that the government will be able to deal with this issue going forward in the future? And from this resident interview, this person said, hell no, I don't trust the government to respond well to these issues in the future. This was Clackamas person. And then another person, a female this time in Clackamas, she said, no, I don't. But our own reason was that she said, because look at what they're doing right now. And I think maybe she's thinking about the federal government, because this was a period where they were also announcing the issue of stopping food stamps and whatnot. And so she was really concerned. She said, they're trying to take away, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare for people that rely on this stuff. Food stamps, he says, I don't like that they are taking away those resources. I feel they need to increase those resources. And so this idea that as we see climate change begin to happen, or the impacts on people, it is not the time to begin to cut corners on social safety nets, on resources that people need, because this is actually the time that we need to increase it. So that's one of the key arguments she made. And then another person, said, the government isn't ready for this climate battle. She said, and he was saying that neighbors need to be there for one another. And he's a Portland resident and says, no, that I don't think the government is going to be able to be the one to respond. He says, I really think a lot of these things are really just up to neighbors. He says, the government are not really going to be able to check on every house and see if they have an air conditioner, or to see if their neighbor is still alive. And he says, like it's just not going to be up to the government. And he's conceptualizing it's about up to neighbors to kind of take up the responsibility to help one another. And then another thing that I wanted to bring our attention to is that a lot of those findings that are popping up about the Collie neighborhood and some of the other areas that I mentioned is that it's not as though people are not aware. So this report came out in the Oregonian this year, in January about some of the actions that people are willing to take to address climate change in Collie neighborhood, for instance. And one of the key things they are trying to implement is what is called urban renewal. But there has been this tension about renewing those neighborhoods. Obviously, it's a neighborhood that experienced air pollution, wildfire, heat wave, people died there. It's also a place that is socially vulnerable, low resilience. So it's all of those findings that we share with you. There is evidence in Collie. And so in terms of what they were doing, but what people were saying is, urban renewal is what has driven people out of Portland, inner areas in Portland, pushed people to Collie. And so to try to use urban renewal as a way to address this problem, some people thought it was problematic because they felt it could lead to displacement as well. So what the government is trying to do in collaboration with the community is to raise $350 million over 30 years and invest this money into transforming the houses in this location. Many of the locations have mobile homes and really just make changes. But there are these concerns that how do you recoup the money back? And the argument they're saying is that, okay, you're going to increase property taxes, and that property tax will be used to pay back the bonds that will be borrowed. And so people are concerned that in future, it's going to lead to gentrification or displacement. But for now, it seemed like the urban renewal plan is going ahead. And like I mentioned, in this neighborhood, it was historically white, but majority, half of more than the population are now Hispanic, Blacks, Asian. And so people are also concerned about future displacement, even as they're thinking about what are the best solutions to deal with this climatic impact that is essentially compounded in this neighborhood. And so I promise I'm wrapping up. So apart from all of those analyses and the stories from people, we also looked at policy documents to see, okay, up until 2021, so we looked at policy from 2016 to 2021, 13 hazard mitigation plans were analyzed. We also analyzed 4 climate adaptation plans to see, do they take into consideration consecutive or cascading disasters, the way we have framed it? And also, what are the strategies for responding to this issue? What we found is that all of those policies, they were discussing hazard in silo terms, like in singular terms, as opposed to looking at the connections between them, or that it could happen like, in very short span of the other. So that was a gap that we identified. But we also identified that extreme heat and wildfire generator smoke was the least. They were not significantly addressed in any of those policy. A lot of policy talked about flooding, which is not surprising. If you look at the FEMA analysis I showed you, and also the analysis from shelters, the disasters we experienced in the past in the region is largely flooding or wind-related disasters, not so much heat wave, but we're seeing that heat wave is becoming a big issue, and wildfire generator smoke is also becoming a big issue. And so we're recommending that, the next set of policies in this region needs to take those issues into account and really develop a robust way of dealing with them. And then another thing we observed in our analysis of this document is that when it comes to equity issues, social vulnerability, and disaster risk reduction, which are important, they were mentioned in different chapters of the paper, of the policies, but they were not often brought together as something that we need to think about simultaneously, like the low resilience of people, the high social vulnerability in the same area, the equity, the disaster risk issue need to be thought together as a holistic problem. And so those are some of the gaps we identify in the policy. So in terms of future plans, we're hoping to, do a predictive modeling of future scenarios. If we were to experience what we experienced in 2021, like that kind of heat wave in 2050 or 2080, what would it look like? So we're doing some work to kind of give us an understanding of what that would be, and trying to also align our policy analysis to better connect with the priorities of residents and their experiences. And we'll be communicating these findings to a range of stakeholders. I mean, including you guys, you're already hearing what the findings are. So we hope to communicate to others. And just to say, in terms of the framing for our future work, this is something we've just started doing a couple of days, looking at if we got that 2021 event, this is what it was, what would it look like in 2050? And you can see it's really going to be really horrible if that event happened in 2050. And so we're trying to create a virtual reality well, we're working on that, that could show what this would look like to people if in 2050 and 2000s, and what mitigation measures we need to be taking locally to address climate change. So that's a wrap-up of everything we're working on in this project. And I really just want to acknowledge not just the people that I mentioned earlier who are co-authors on the paper, but also there are other people, staffs at PSU here that were also supportive of this project. And thank you all for listening. I'm happy to take questions. I'm just going to stop sharing now.
Thanks, Joel. That was great.
Thank you.
I guess we have a few minutes, so could open it up if anyone has any questions. I guess I could start it off. So I had one question, just like specifically about the heat deaths. So I think it's just interesting to see like that there's that many heat deaths just from one like extreme heat event that occurred.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you have any like specific thoughts of ideas that could help, you know, in the case of another extreme heat event like that, just to kind of limit those deaths, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, great question, Matt. Really, really important. So what I mentioned in terms of the issue of lack of preparedness, it's a shame that in 2018, when I did that work, even though it wasn't one of the things that I explored, there has been other researchers here in Portland who have been talking about it being an issue. But I don't think that, you know, those research were taken seriously until we had that 2021 heat death. And so since that event, some policy documents have been created, like temporary. It's not like the final hazard mitigation plan, they're working on it, but some documents have come out in Multnomah particularly. And one of the issues that they're trying to do is to make sure that, number one, they open the shelters early, because one of the gap was that they said the cooling shelters were not opened early. Number two, people were not allowed to bring their pets in some cases. And number three, some communities couldn't get to the cooling areas because it was far from where they are. So if you remember that analysis you did about where the cooling areas are, where the libraries, it looks like there were a lot of libraries, but not cooling or even emergency areas where people could go to. And that was the issue. For many people, it was also far from their homes. And then the TriMet and the TriMet stopped working, which it was free, but it wasn't working. And so people couldn't even get a free transportation from their home to those areas where there were a lot of support for the heat. And I think those are some changes that the city and certainly the county level governments are aware of, that we need to make sure the cooling centers are open early. We need to give people early warning and not wait for too long for them to get support, but also make sure the transportation systems are working. And also just remember, this happened during COVID, right? So there was the COVID isolation that was already there. So the idea of going to somebody's houses or someone's home and knocking on the door and saying, let me help you, was an issue for some people because of COVID. And so if this were to happen in a situation where there was no COVID, I imagine that we may see, because Portland is really high on mutual aid and people helping one another. So I imagine we may see more people go out and knock on doors, their neighbors' doors, and say, you know, how can we help you? You need to get to a cooling shelter. But the COVID issue, I think, played a role in why maybe some people didn't get as quick of a support from their neighbors as well as they would have gotten. So, and then another thing I wanted to add again was a lot of people that died were also elderly people. So that's another issue, the challenge being elderly and not being able to get help quickly and not to get transportation to where you need to be for cooling shelter. All of those things stacked up in terms of, you know, how it eventually led to so much death from one heat wave. So that's a really good question.
Thanks. Do you have a question, Chris or Gabriela?
Yes. Thank you very much, Yola, for the presentation. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Whether you are thinking to expand this work to see how the climate change in Portland is affecting the economic activity. Say, what's the difference between, I don't know what kind of industry you have in Portland, agricultural activity, maybe services. So that would be important to determine, you know, the social impact or economic impact of climate change in order to implement policies, right?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because one of my colleagues in California actually documented the impact of the heat they experienced, not the same one as Scotland, but the one they had, that there has been papers coming out showing the impact of heat on undocumented migrants working in agricultural sector. And so what we asked the Oregon Health Authority to share with us, I think this is something we could do as well, is to analyze the data they share with us for the heat wave to look at the occupation of people who died. So if we do that, it will be interesting to see if some of them, I don't know if we will have information about undocumented migrants, because that's a protected, and then people protect themselves, right? And so their information may not show up. But if there are other information about my agricultural workers who are documented, it will be interesting to see if the analysis that we do in terms of who occupationally who died, if there were people working outdoors as opposed to just people living in their homes. I think that'll be something interesting to explore. But you're right. From this analysis we've done, I think we may have missed some categories of people who, even if they did not die, who may have been severely impacted by the heat wave. And that's certainly the people who are undocumented working in the agricultural sector in Oregon. I think that's a group we must remember and maybe write about, even if we don't have, evidence of that people die. But I've seen papers that talked about the impact on outdoor workers, and particularly documented and undocumented migrant agricultural workers. Yeah. So thank you for that question.
I'm sorry, can I, no, I was thinking about that too, but mostly, for example, the productivity, how the productivity in agriculture decreases or as a result of climate change. I was thinking about
I see.
What economic activities, industries or sectors.
Yeah, that's another, that's a good question. So we didn't look at agricultural productivity in Oregon, but I have a colleague who is also on the NCAP project. She is studying, research is about working with farmers to implement certain climate change scenarios to see how their productivity, but also how their own knowledge shape how they respond or adapt to climate change, but also how climate scenarios, if given to them, how they might use it. So that's something I could, find out about, but we didn't look at agriculture in our study at all. Chris, yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, thank you. I guess you could see me somewhere. So I'm not a student, and I don't want to take time away from the grad students. I was just curious. Thank you for the work, of course. I spent a lot of time in California with local governments doing emergency planning, where are the shelters going to be and all of that. But I'm interested in how you addressed sort of the underlying demographics. In other words, what would have been the usual death rate without the heat wave? How many people would have died anyway? What's the population density of the neighborhoods? Because you would expect more deaths based on density or age distribution. And then, you talked about COVID, which was an unusual vulnerability to some people that might have increased the death rate. I just wondered how you address those topics, if you could. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that's something that we were thinking about. I will start with the COVID one, because I also asked my students to get me the data on COVID-related deaths during that period. So, which is a different data. So the data we asked the Oregon Health Authority to give us data that they designated as heat-related deaths, because I was concerned that what if, COVID was actually what led to some people's death and not heat? Now, how do we know this? Or maybe COVID exacerbated their deaths, So that's something I was concerned about myself. But the data that we were supplied with from the OHA was, they, in their own designation, it said it's death. So that's something, but who knows? Maybe it's COVID plus heat. So that's one thing. But the other issue you mentioned about density, maybe of the tract, about population distribution. Indeed, yeah, elderly people were the highest number of people who died, maybe for many reasons, right? Underlying issues, or the fact that people feel they could deal with the heat. You know how we were worried about other kinds of disasters, but when it comes to heat, we feel like our body can adjust. And so we miscalculate that heat exertion can kill. And so, yeah, there were also some younger people that died. With, I think from between 35 and 55, a few people also died. So that's something to keep in mind, though the majority were elderly people. But in terms of the population density per tract, that's something I think we could look into and see if that really mattered in terms of the death. But to your overall question about would people have died without the heat? I don't know, and I don't think so. I've been in Portland for 5 years. I've not heard about these like 96 or in the metro region about 70 plus deaths in the span of 2 days. I don't think people would have died. That's just my opinion. In 2 days without the heat wave. It's never happened since I've been here. I mean, people die of other things like gun-related, violence or whatever. But no, I've never heard of that in Oregon. No, so I would not think people would have, that number of people would have died without the heat wave. So.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thanks everyone. I guess now I could ask that the faculty could leave the call and just the grad students could stick around. Okay.